Good morning. Hope everyone is doing well this morning. My name is Bryan, for those of you who don't know me, and it's good to be here with you, although I suppose technically I'm not here with you. But anyway, we are going to be in Job chapter 38 this morning. What do you know? And I suppose there are different ways that we can ask that question, right? We can ask that in a way of surprise and delight. Well, what do you know? Like, look what I found, that flash drive that I lost, I just suddenly reappeared. Or we could ask it in a kind of condescending kind of way. Well, what do you know? And it's kind of a rhetorical question, isn't it? And it expects the answer that, well, not very much. And like you're out of your depth and you don't know what you're talking about. And then there is that genuine searching question, what do you know? Trying to genuinely discover what it is that somebody knows. And often, we have to prove to other people or to institutions or whatever it may be what we do know before we're actually allowed to do something. We have to prove that we know how to drive a car before we get a license to go out and drive. But sometimes we find out that we don't know as much as we think we know. We're undertaking a painting project inside our house right now. And when I say we, I mean my wife, Leslie, is undertaking the project, not me. I do know how to paint. In fact, I've painted a lot of things in my life. Houses, inside, outside, boats, all kinds of other stuff. And when you start painting, what is the first thing you need? Well, the first thing you need is paint, right? So we toddle along to the paint shop and they ask, well, what colour? And fortunately, we did know what colour, or at least Leslie knew what colour she wanted. And it was a light grey. But do you know how many different kinds of light grey there are? There's light French, there's repose grey, whatever repose grey is. There was also a mindful grey. I thought that might be kind of useful. And but we settled on this colour called agreeable grey. Looked fine, looked much like all the other greys as far as I could tell, but Leslie said that was the best one because there was a hint of beige in it. And if she says there's a hint of beige in it, then I suppose there's a hint of beige in it. But then that isn't the end of the matter right there, right? Because we chosen the agreeable grey, but then do you want a matte finish or a satin finish? And then there was 4 different kinds of paint: cashmere, emerald, super paint, and duration. And what was the difference between all those, apart from the $20 price per tin? And the woman, she was very agreeable. She wasn't grey, but she didn't seem to know what the difference was, which is kind of odd. If you think that you work in a paint shop, maybe you should be able to answer those questions. But we come back to the question, well, what do you know? And sometimes we don't know what we don't know until we're put into a situation that reveals our lack of knowledge and our lack of understanding. We just go painting about in our lives, and then suddenly out of nowhere something happens and we don't have an answer. And we want answers because when something happens in our lives, we want the knowledge to be able to fix whatever that is. But can we live actually without knowing? We're in this series called God Questions. And actually, it's a series of questions that God asks different individuals about what they know. In the first one we looked at, he asked the first human beings, where are you? Who told you? And what have you done? The second one, he asked Cain, where is your brother? The third one, he asked Hagar, where have you come from and where are you going? And then he asked Jacob what his name was, about his identity, and Moses about what he has in his hand, and Elijah, what are you doing here? And last week we looked at Jonah, and God asked Jonah, do you do well to be angry? And the purpose of God's questions is for us to examine ourselves and see what we think we know. Because that's often what it just takes, right? Just a simple question that stops us in our tracks and makes us examine our lives and the trajectory of our lives. Well, this morning, God is asking man what he knows. not in so many words, but with a whole series of questions. The man was not looking for questions, though. He was looking for answers. And yet it was in God's questions that this man found his answers and he found his reassurance. Because what really matters is not what we know, but what God knows and whether God knows us. Well, what are all these questions? Let's read Job chapter 38. We're going to read 1 through 24. And it's just kind of a sample of the questions because the questions go on for like nearly 4 chapters. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it and set bars and doors and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed? Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken off out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and its features stand out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and their uplifted arm is broken. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this. Where is the way to the dwelling of light, and where is the place of darkness, that you may take to its territory, and that you may discern the paths to its home? You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? What is the way to the place where the light is distributed, or where the east wind is scattered upon the earth? The book of Job is one of my favourite books. And it is a book that belongs in the wisdom section of the Old Testament, along with Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Psalms, and Song of Songs, because it addresses how we apply what we know. And knowledge, we have to remember, is not wisdom. Often that's the mistake we make today. We think that knowledge is wisdom. Just because we know something doesn't mean we know how to apply it. There's lots of knowledge, but there's lack of application. And especially if it's missing the essential ingredient of God himself. We're not going to get the right application if we don't apply knowledge without God being part of it. And the story of Job starts that he lived in this place called Uz, and he was blameless and upright, one who fears God and turned away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had a lot of stuff, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and many servants. And is summed up as that he was the greatest of all the people of the East. Brilliant, right? So what did Job know about life, and what did Job know about God? Well, what Job knew is that if you lived a good life, God would bless you. And if you didn't live a good life, then bad things would happen to you. And a lot of people in this world still live their lives that way, right? That is their kind of knowledge of how to live life. If you do good, good will happen to you. And if you do bad, bad will happen to you. But who is actually in control if you live that way? Is that God or yourself? And Job was really meticulous about this, because every now and again his kids would get together and they'd have a bit of a party. And Job was kind of worried in case they said something amiss during the party. And so just to make sure that God was all right with them, he would make sacrifices. and make sure that God was assuaged. And that's what Job knew about life and about God. But then one day, a breathless messenger arrived before Job. The oxen were plowing, and these raiders came and took them and killed the servants. And just when that messenger had finished telling his tale, another came and talked about how fire had come down from heaven and barbecued all his sheep and the servants. And then another messenger came and told about another group of raiders, and they'd taken all his camels and again killed all his servants. And then finally another messenger came and said that his sons and daughters had been having one of their parties, and a massive wind had come along and knocked the house down on them, and they were all dead. And Job responded to all this news with, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And that's a good answer, right? And that's a righteous answer, but it doesn't answer the burning question of why. Why did this happen? How could this have happened with what he knew, right? That he was doing good, and yet this terrible disaster has entered into his life. But of course, that wasn't the end of disaster that hit Job, because a bit later, as he was sifting through the wreckage of his life, maybe he buried his kids, seen for himself what had taken place, he was struck by sores all over his body. Have you ever had like measles or chicken pox? Maybe you don't get that these days because there's vaccine, but maybe you've had wasp stings or bee stings, and they itch, right? They come up and they itch, and if you're covered all over from head to toe in that, yeah, that's just a picture of misery, isn't it? And Job is sitting there and he's kind of scratching these sores with a bit of broken pottery. And his wife turns up and asks Job if he still holds on to his integrity. Why not just curse God, die, get it over and done with? Because as far as she's concerned, it's over, it's finished. But Job tells her not to talk like one of the foolish women who don't know anything about God. And two things that Job is hanging on to: the fact that he didn't deserve this, and his desire for an answer from God about why it had happened. And then Job has three mates, and they turn up. Their names are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And for 7 days they sit in silence, and that's good. And then Job starts to process about everything that's happened to him, and he processes verbally. And his friends don't like it because it makes them nervous, because it means that if what Job is saying is true, then the same could be true in their lives, and maybe they're not in control of their lives as much as they might like to think, and they don't like that kind of knowledge. And it's at this point that the book changes from prose into poetry. And for 30-odd chapters, these four, they argue back and forth about what they know. But the thing is, of course, they know basically the same thing. The only difference is that Job has experienced something different to the other three, which has caused him to question exactly what he does know and how he applies what he knows. Because what he knows doesn't explain what's happened to him in his current situation. He wants to know why. But would the why, if he really knew why, would that reassure him? And so they argue themselves eventually to a standstill. And then this young man, Elihu, appears kind of out of nowhere, but he's burning with anger because the friends haven't been able to shoot down Job with their knowledge. And, it's funny, isn't it, that we're always so quick to tell people about what they should know in their situation and how they should be. But then finally, God shows up. And his question to Job is, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me." Because Job had postulated a lot about his situation, he painted this picture about how the world works and who God is and how God is supposed to act towards his creation. But was Job right? Did he really know? What do you know about God this morning? What do you know about the world we live in and how God organizes it? We do that, we try and satisfy our desire to know, but why do we need to know? What do we need to know? If God was to ask you this morning, what do you know? What knowledge would you give as an answer? What knowledge would be so reassuring to you that it would cover the question, why? Well, the first thing that God asked Job about was his source. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? In verse 21, God rather kind of sarcastically asked, you know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. I don't just like painting walls. I actually like art too. Not painting art, I wouldn't be any good at that. But I actually like going to look at art from time to time. And one of my favourite paintings is a picture called the Haywain, and it hangs in the National Gallery in London. And I've seen it several times, and I thought that I knew it pretty well. But the last time I was there, I was standing there just looking at it and soaking in the scenery. And there was a couple standing next to me, and apparently this chap knew a lot about the picture. And so I started eavesdropping on their conversation. And it turned out that originally Constable, the chap that painted the picture, had painted a barrel and a rider in the picture. But then he decided that he didn't want that in his composition and had painted over the top of it. But as the picture has aged, I don't know, it's a couple of 100 years old now, the paint has faded a little bit, and you can just make out underneath in his composition a barrel and a rider if you look really, really closely. And if he'd left that in, of course, that would have changed the whole complexion of the picture. And I wouldn't have really known that unless I'd overheard this conversation. You know, Job thinks he has the whole picture, right? But actually, he does not have the whole picture of why disaster came upon him. Because there's another scene that takes place in heaven. And this scene is when the angels come into heaven, and one of these angels is Satan, Hasatan. He is the accuser. And God asked Hasatan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, upright, and he turns away from evil. And as it happens, Satan had considered God's servant Job, because he has a question for God of his own. Is it for nothing that Job fears God? And when Satan thinks that the only reason that Job serves God is because he doesn't want his stuff to be taken away, and that if he loses his stuff, then he will curse God and give up on God. I was reading an article the other day about Christian soccer players, and it was kind of an interesting article. And but one comment underneath said, well, you know, it's so easy for multi-millionaire sports stars, you know, to give credit to God. And in a way, that's right. It is, isn't it? But nonetheless, Satan takes it all away. And then he goes back for a second time to heaven, right? And God asks Satan where he's been. And Satan says, well, I've been walking up and down on the earth. And again, God asks, have you considered my servant Job? You incited me to take away his stuff, but he still holds fast to his integrity. And then Satan says, yeah, but skin for skin. You take away his health and he will curse you. And God says, okay, take it away. And so Satan does. And Job never knows all this. He is completely oblivious to it. And maybe that's just as well, I don't know, you know. That's that scene, right, from A Few Good Men. You know, you can't handle the truth. And we probably couldn't handle the truth because I suspect a lot goes on behind the scenes that we absolutely do not know anything about. We think that we know so much about everything that goes on, but we are limited creatures of time and space. And we talk about creation as if we know exactly what took place, but how do we know? We weren't there. The answer is we don't unless it is revealed to us. Scientifically, of course, we do know some stuff about the world and the universe. Matter reveals something to us, but it also leaves a lot of questions. And again, we weren't there when it was all created. And we can't have our questions answered unless we can find someone that was there. Again, we can kind of see some stuff from matter, but those important questions of why or who, it doesn't answer. And that not knowing leaves us wondering, right? Because we live in this crazy world and things happen that we can't really explain. And if we could just know a bit more, then maybe we could get life and the world and the universe under control, because it just looks so out of control. And it would be better if we knew how to control it more. Job had said, well, it would been better if I had not been born at all. It's kind of a trend right now that there's a reluctance for people to bring other lives into this world, because the world does seem to be crazy and out of control. But what if someone had been born into this world who knows it all? And maybe he doesn't give us all the answers that we're looking for, but we can rest in the fact that this person has all the answers himself. Would that reassure us? If he had control over everything, from the smallest things to the greatest things. We wouldn't have to know how he did it. We would just have to believe and have faith and trust that he can do it. And we could hang on to that, right? That no matter what situation we face, no matter whether we understand it, whether we know how to deal with it or not, there is someone who does. And we can trust that one person and that he knows. Paul, writing about Jesus, tells us actually all we need to know. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. What do you know about the source of life? Well, we all have questions and we all wonder why, but in Jesus Christ, we find everything that we need to know. Second, not only is it the source, but what is essential for our source is our existence. During his discourse, Job talks a lot about his experience of life. But God asks him, have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare it if you know all this. Have you entered into the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? In that National Gallery in London, there's another painting, maybe a bit more famous than Constable's Haywain, and that is Van Gogh's Sunflowers. And I wandered over to have a look at that, and there's crowds and crowds of people around it, and they all had their phones out, and they're all like taking pictures of the picture, right? And in fact, they were taking selfies with the picture behind them, as if like somehow that makes the picture better. I can't quite work that one out. And then they leave, right, without actually really looking at the picture itself. It's like, have you really experienced it? I mean, do you really know the painting? Because, if that's all you want is a picture of Van Gogh's Sunflowers, you can probably find that online, and it's going to be a better picture than what you took. Because really that's the whole point, isn't it, of going to an art gallery and sit and look at the brushstrokes and the texture and the details. And That's why we go to experience that. And we live in a world where it's kind of, the more experiences we have, the more relevant we feel. And we reel off a list of various experiences that we've had. And with those experiences, we justify our lives. And if you can show all those experiences on social media or whatever it is you use, and that experience equals justification. And it also equals knowledge to an extent, right? And that's true. To some extent, what we experience does add to our knowledge. But again, our experience is limited because we are finite creatures. But I also notice that we only want the good experiences. We don't want the bad experiences because we don't really know how to handle those. We don't like to stick those in our albums and take selfies with those behind us. Because those experiences make us feel powerless, like our knowledge can't handle what's taking place. You know, neither Job nor his friends' knowledge could handle what Job was experiencing. His friends' knowledge told Job that he must have done something really, really bad, and that in order to get his life back on track, he needed to fess up and maybe God would forgive him. But Job doesn't do that, right? He clings to his integrity that he had not done anything to warrant the situation that he was in. God asked Job if he had commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place, if he'd entered the storehouses of snow and hell, if he'd comprehended the expanse of the earth, walked in the recesses of the deep, had he actually experienced any of these things? And we might say, well, yeah, you know what, Bryan, I've travelled a little bit. I've been to some mountains. I've seen some of the earth. I've swum in the sea, maybe even done some scuba diving. Do you know, like the oceans cover 75% of the Earth's surface, and only 5% of the oceans have been explored. You know, we try to justify our existence by our experiences, and the more we have, the more we know, and the more we can give answers. But our experiences are just limited. And even the greatest experiences don't compare with what God has experienced. Because we want to experience, don't we, what it is like to be God. But we can't, because we're not God. We are created beings, we are not the Creator. So how can we find some assurance in the fact that we actually can't and don't know what it's like to be God? Well, we might not know what it's like to be God, but God knows what it's like to be us. Because He has experienced what we've experienced. Because Jesus Christ came to earth as a human being, as a man, and He's experienced birth, and He's experienced death, and He has experienced everything in between, hunger and satisfaction, and laughter and sorrow, aching muscles. He's experienced it all. And then He's experienced so much more than we can ever experience. And it wasn't the good experience either, the happy selfie. He hung on a cross. And He bled, and He died in agony and humiliation. And He took our sin upon Himself, something that we won't have to experience, because He experienced all that for us. Although we deserve that experience, all of us, because we've all turned away and walked away from God, because of Jesus, when we put our faith and our trust in Him, we don't have to experience any of that. As Paul says, for while we were still weak at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows His love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have now been justified by His blood, much more shall we be saved by Him from the wrath of God. For if while we were enemies we were reconciled to God by the death of His Son, much more now that we are reconciled shall we be saved by His life. What do you know? If you've experienced Jesus, you are justified. And you don't need to know any other experience other than knowing Jesus. And lastly, What do you know about the outcome? God asked Job, have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? And God here is talking about the place of the dead. Does Job know the entrance and how to get there? In chapter 14, Job had actually asked, if a man dies, shall he live again? What is the outcome of life? It's kind of like when you're painting. I imagine if you're an artist, you start painting, or even if you're just painting a room, you choose your paint and you don't really know how it's all going to turn out when you start painting. Will the colour look good when it's finished, when the furniture's put back in and the carpet's back in? You don't really know when you start out. And the same is when we have questions, right? That Job had clung to the hope that he would get answers for his questions, and he thought about how he could bring his case before God, and he kind of envisions this courtroom scene. But how could he get God to play fair? Because after all, God was so much bigger than him, and he would need a mediator, a redeemer. And we have those famous verses, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. My heart faints within me. But Job still didn't know how or who that mediator was. But we do. That we know who Job's Redeemer is, the same person as our Redeemer, our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ. And we know that our Redeemer, although he died, he was raised again from the dead. Because if he wasn't raised again from the dead, as Paul says, there's not much point in us being here this morning. We may as well go and do other things. But Jesus Christ is raised from the dead. And some of us think, that when Jesus says that he's coming back, that we need to know all those details in the future about how that's going to work out. Times and signs and this and that. And why do we want to know? Well, sometimes it's because we just want to take control of the situation. We're uneasy with questions that are left unanswered about how God is going to do it exactly. Perhaps because we don't trust the one with the answers. Before Jesus went to the cross, his disciples were asking him lots of questions, and Jesus said, well, I'm going away, and I'm going away to my Father's house, and there are many rooms in my Father's house, and I'm going to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I'll come again so I can come and take you to that place, right? And you know where I'm going. And Thomas is like, no, we don't know where you're going, Jesus. And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes to the Father except through me. I don't know about you, but I have a lot of questions. And if I paint with this and that, and how will it turn out? And if this happens or that happens, how will it turn out? And I just wish I could know for sure. But one thing we can know for certain is how it's going to turn out when we put our faith and our trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. Paul reminds us that, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. What do you know about the outcome? We don't have to have all the answers about how, just the answer about who. In the end, Job repented, not that he'd lost his integrity, he'd maintained that, and he did not curse God, he did not turn away from God, but he did speak a few things about God which he did not know. And in the end, he confessed that to God. I spoke about things about you which I did not know. And you speak, Lord, and I will listen, and I will question you, and you make it known to me, instead of the other way around of me making it known to you. Well, what do you know this morning? Well, hopefully you do know a few things, and maybe after this morning you may hopefully know something else too. But at the end of the day, we won't know everything, and we will still have those why questions. But those why questions and can be answered, and we can be reassured in the questions that God asks us about where we were, about our source, about our experiences, and about the outcome. I just want to finish up with Psalm 131. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me, but I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. And Lord, this morning we put our hope in you, in the knowledge of who you are and what you've done. And although we don't have the knowledge of why so very often in our lives, yet we trust in you, believe in you, have faith in you, and hope in you. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.